When two security officers attempted to escort a black Marine from his son's graduation ceremony, no one could have imagined that 6 Navy SEALs would silently arrive from the audience, halting the entire hall without uttering a single word. Solomon Dreeden had no expectation of being recognized when he steered his car into the parking area behind Elm Ridge High. The school resembled countless others scattered across small towns in Texas, aged red bricks, flags waving gently over the main doors, students lingering near the gym entrance. The lot was already overflowing. Fathers in pressed shirts, mothers clutching bouquets, siblings with handmade signs, even a grandmother leaning on her walker. It was a familiar, bustling picture of a graduation day. He pulled his Dodge Charger beside the chain-link fence and stepped out, smoothing the crisp lines of his dark blue Marine dress uniform. His boots shone like glass, not to impress anyone, but because he'd never learned how to do things halfway. His posture stood tall and precise, his expression calm but weighted with the silence of a man who had seen too much of life to be easily shaken. He had driven 8 long hours from Temple just to witness his son's high school graduation. Flying would have been faster, but the Charger had belonged to his late wife. Even after 2 years without her, the hum of its engine made him feel as though she was still there beside him. Opening the glove compartment, Solomon took out a small, time-worn photograph, a picture of his wife cradling their son, Tyron, as a baby. A soft hair ran through the corner. He looked at it for a moment, then slipped it gently into the inner pocket of his jacket. "I promise you," he whispered, "I wouldn't miss it." His walk toward the entrance was deliberate, every step measured. Something stirred in his chest, a feeling caught somewhere between pride and pain. Inside, the gymnasium buzzed with life. Rows of metal chairs covered the floor, bleachers packed to capacity. The air smelled faintly of popcorn and wax, a familiar blend of celebration. He handed his printed ticket to a volunteer, a short man holding a clipboard and wearing a headset. The man squinted, nodded quickly, and pointed to the 3rd row on the left. "You're all set. Family section up front." "Thank you," Solomon replied evenly, making his way through the rows. A few people turned their heads as he passed, eyes catching the uniform before quickly darting away. One woman smiled faintly, then whispered something to the man beside her. Solomon ignored it. He'd been tall, black, and in uniform long enough to understand which glances carried respect and which didn't. He's Saturday. The plastic chair wobbled slightly beneath him, but he made no complaint. Ahead, the stage was ready. Silver banners stretched across the wall reading class of 2024. Members of the school board hovered near the podium, reviewing their notes. His eyes searched the lines of robed students until he spotted Tyron, tall, thin, with his mother's same soft eyes. 18 years, gone in a flash. He remembered the night his son was born, still wearing his fatigues, dirt caked under his nails. He had flown in from Okinawa on a 4-day leave just to be there. And now, here they were again, on another milestone. Noise surrounded him. Chairs scraping, paper programs rustling, laughter spilling from the aisles. But Solomon remained still, eyes locked on the stage, his hand brushing lightly against a photograph in his jacket. The first notes of pomp and circumstance began to play, and the crowd rose as one. Solomon stood as well, shoulders firm, arms straight. Then came the national anthem. Everyone placed a hand over their heart. Solomon did not move. He didn't need to. His entire stance was a salute. He thought of his wife again, how she would have wept through the whole ceremony, how she would have fussed over Tyron's tie 3 times before letting him leave. His eyes stayed fixed forward. But as the final note faded, 2 uniformed men started down the side aisle, heading straight toward him. The pair wore black polo shirts tucked into tactical pants, radios clipped to their belts. Their badges read Holland Security Services. One was broad and stocky, head shaved smooth, his jaw tight. The other was tall and wiry, jaw working as he chewed gum. Solomon saw them immediately, but he didn't flinch. Years of training had taught him that stillness could command more power than movement. His hands rested calmly on his thighs as a shorter guard stopped beside him and leaned close. "Sir," the guard said quietly, "we're going to need you to come with us." Solomon turned his head slowly. "Is there a problem?" The taller one stepped closer. "Yeah, this section's for families of graduating seniors." Solomon blinked once, then drew the ticket from his coat pocket, the same one he'd already shown. This is my seat. Third row, left side. Family seating confirmed. The shorter guard didn't glance at it. We were told it's full. It was full when I sat down, too, Solomon replied evenly. Mind telling me who gave that order? The tall guard shifted his weight, suddenly less sure of himself. Look, sir, it's not a big deal. There's space in the back. Let's not make this harder than it needs to be. Solomon's eyes narrowed, not with anger, but with that calm, deliberate focus that only discipline can teach. I drove 8 hours to see my son walk that stage, he said quietly. I'll be staying right here. A few heads began to turn. A woman 2 rows over nudged her husband and motioned toward the commotion. Someone in the bleachers angled their phone slightly, perhaps recording. The shorter guard straightened, eyes flicking across the crowd. Say, I'm going to ask you one last time, he said, his tone tight. You can keep asking all day, Solomon replied, his voice lower now, steadier, carrying an edge of command. I'm not moving. The taller guard sucked his teeth. Maybe you'd be more comfortable in the back, he said. That's all we're suggesting. And that was it, the phrase that changed the air. Solomon turned his head fully toward him. Those words weren't about seating or policy. They carried an older meaning, one he'd known all his life, in offices, waiting rooms, front porches, and even military cafeterias. Always wrapped in politeness, whispered just beneath the surface. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. The atmosphere around him shifted, that quiet ripple that comes when everyone realizes a line has been crossed. The short guard noticed it too. He thumbed his radio, muttering something into the MIC without looking away from Solomon. But Solomon stayed seated, still as stone, facing forward. To him, the discussion was over. Beside him, an older white-haired woman leaned in slightly and whispered, "Don't you let them move you." He gave a small nod in acknowledgement, but said nothing. He hadn't come here for confrontation. He'd come to watch his son graduate, just like any other father. But the guard weren't done. The taller one leaned in again, lowering his voice. Look, if you've got an issue, take it up with the office. We're just following orders. Solomon turned his head slowly. You got a name, son? The guard blinked. It's Officer Malley. Not officer, Solomon corrected evenly. You're private security. The other guard stepped closer, jaw tight. That's enough. If you don't stand up. He never finished the sentence, because at that moment, the far gym door opened with a soft click, and 6 men walked in. No uniforms, no badges, just the unmistakable bearing of soldiers, straight backs, squared shoulders, and eyes that had seen more than most would ever understand. They didn't enter as a unit. They drifted in separately, taking positions across the gym as though they were strangers. But anyone paying attention could see it, the way they moved, the way they scanned the room, the way they sat still and alert. Solomon didn't turn. He didn't have to. He knew exactly who they were. The guards, however, did not, and they were about to learn. He kept his eyes on the stage, jaw locked, mind sharpening like a blade being drawn. He wasn't angry, not yet, but something within him clicked into alignment, that old switch reserved for moments that demanded restraint, control, and quiet readiness. The guards lingered. Their presence wasn't about enforcing a rule anymore. It was about reminding him who supposedly had the power. What they couldn't grasp was that Solomon had lived through places where power determined life or death. This was just a gymnasium, folding chairs, chatter, and polished floors. A name was called from the stage, and polite applause followed. But the audience near the third row wasn't watching the ceremony anymore. They were watching this. Malley shifted again, lowering his voice. Look, man, I'm trying to do you a favor. This doesn't have to turn ugly. Solomon's gaze slid toward him. You don't have the kind of favor I need. A pause hung between them. Malley hesitated, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. The shorter guard, Garvin, according to his badge, wasn't as cautious. His jaw tightened, hand hovering near his radio once more. A few rows back, a man rose slowly to his feet. No one noticed at first. He didn't say a word, just crossed his arms and stared, his frame broad, his eyes sharp. He sat down again near the aisle, never breaking his focus. Another man stood up on the opposite side of the gym. Same calm, same poise. Then a third. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Solomon knew each of them by instinct, by presence alone. These were his men, the ones he had led through mud, through silence, through fire and chaos. Garvin leaned forward again, irritation creeping into his tone. "Listen, man, you're turning this into a situation." Solomon turned his head, slow and precise. "And you're not listening." Garvin's hand twitched toward his radio, but before he could press it, a voice cut through the tension from about 10 feet away. "Is there a reason this man's being bothered?" It was calm, commanding, the kind of voice that didn't raise to gain attention but dropped low enough to silence everyone else. A tall man stood in the center aisle, salt and pepper beard, tailored black coat over a gray shirt. His name was Creed Marston, the same Creed Marston whom Solomon had dragged from a burning transport outside Kandahar, 200 yards through sand and shrapnel, under a sky that rained fire. Garvin looked up, thrown off balance. "Who are you?" Creed didn't answer. He stepped forward once. "I asked you a question." Malley lifted a hand cautiously. "Sir, we've got it under control." "No," Creed replied, his voice sharp as glass. "You don't." Another man stood up from the far bleachers. Then another, now 4 of them. Solomon stayed perfectly still, silent, focused. Half the gym had stopped pretending to watch the stage. A teacher was trying to redirect attention, but the students, parents, and even the principal knew something was shifting. Creed took another step closer. "You're embarrassing yourselves," he said evenly, "and you're one breath away from making this worse." Garvin's confidence faltered. He glanced at Malley, who now looked unsure, his earlier authority cracking. It was becoming painfully clear they hadn't expected that this man, sitting quietly in the 3rd row, wasn't alone. Not the kind of backup they'd ever expected. "I don't care what orders you were given," Creed said evenly. "You don't lay a hand on that man. You don't tell him to move. You don't ask again." The silence that followed was thick, not from fear, but from a rising respect. The kind of silence that builds when people realize they are witnessing something that matters. Around the gym, the hush spread slowly as the truth of the moment began to sink in. Solomon finally looked up at Creed. A small nod passed between them. Not gratitude, not plea, just recognition. A language shared only between men who had faced the same kind of fire. Creed's eyes softened, just briefly, before he stepped back and lowered himself into his chair, arms folded tight across his chest. The tension, though, didn't fade. It hovered in the air, coiled and expectant, as everyone waited to see what the gods would do next. For Solomon, the gym dissolved. The banners, the faces, the noise, all blurred into the background as memory seized him and dragged him backward 15 years. Afghanistan, Kandahar province, late afternoon. The sun didn't set there. It slammed into the horizon like a hammer, turning sand to rust and the air to molten steel. Solomon, then a gunnery sergeant, had just finished briefing his squad when chaos detonated. A roadside IED tore through the lead Humvee, flipping it like a toy. Shrapnel and earth rained down before anyone could shout a word. Then came the gunfire, not wild, but disciplined. Solomon didn't think. He dropped behind the shattered remains of a doorframe, eyes cutting through smoke and flame. Down the slope, 6 men were pinned behind a burning second vehicle. He spotted one crawling forward, dragging another by his vest. That was Creed Marston, 3 months into deployment, bleeding from a fresh wound in his thigh. Solomon moved. No hesitation, no call for backup. He sprinted through open sand, zigzagging between bursts of gunfire, and slid into cover beside the wreckage. Creed was gasping. Blood streaked across his face. "You're hit," Creed managed. "You noticed," Solomon said flatly. Creed tried to laugh but coughed instead. Solomon hooked his arms under the downed soldier beside them, Sergeant Enrique Soto, and started dragging. Creed pushed from behind, teeth gritted with every inch. "Where's Devers?" Solomon barked. Creed pointed weakly. "Left side, under the hood." That's when Solomon saw him, a young SEAL trapped beneath part of the engine block, leg crushed. He was shouting, voice fading. Without a pause, Solomon told Creed, Stay low. Move when I move. Creed nodded, and that was a moment he understood what leadership looked like. Solomon broke cover again, sprinting across open ground. His boot hit something, rock or bone. He didn't care. He slid beside Divas, crouched low, and gripped the edge of the twisted metal. "Gunny, don't!" Divas yelled. "I'm fine. I'm fine." "You're not staying here," Solomon growled. He planted one foot, braced, and lifted. Muscles screamed, ribs burned, and the metal shrieked, but it moved. Just enough. Divas yanked his leg free, and they fell back together, crawling toward the ridge as bullets kicked sand behind them. Creed reappeared with Soto over his shoulder, limping on his good leg. Lim and Horton followed, faces blackened with soot, rifles raised. When the firing stopped, there were no cheers, no speeches, just 6 men alive, breathing. Solomon was the last to move, keeping watch until the dust settled and the medevac arrived. He didn't speak much afterward, but Creed did, and so did the rest. From that day on, there was no question. If Solomon Dreeden ever needed them, anywhere, anytime, they'd come. Now, back in the gym, Creed sat silently, jaw tight, eyes locked on the guard still standing too close to Solomon. He wasn't thinking about Kandahar anymore. He was thinking about a promise. The man who had carried him through gunfire was now being disrespected in front of a high school crowd for trying to watch his son graduate. Creed's fists clenched. Another SEAL, Javier Meeks, entered quietly, taking a seat 4 rows behind. Then Zachary Wells appeared, positioning himself along the right side bleachers. None of them spoke. They didn't need to. Solomon glanced once toward the back of the gym, his gaze brushing Meeks. That was enough. A signal passed, unspoken but understood. The guards, however, missed it completely. They didn't know what that look meant, but they were about to learn fast. The ceremony continued on the surface. Names still called, families still clapping, laughter forced and brittle. But the room's focus had shifted. Every few seconds, eyes darted toward the 3rd row on the left, where Solomon Dreeden sat unmoving, and 2 guards stood frozen in uncertainty. Garvin looked toward the front. A woman from the school staff was gesturing frantically, whispering something he couldn't hear. Her expression screamed stop. But Garvin shook his head. He wasn't backing down. His pride wouldn't let him. Mally shifted again, jaw tight, gum grinding between his teeth. His discomfort showed, but he still didn't walk away. "Sir," Garvin said again, louder now, trying to reclaim the authority he was losing by the second. "This is your final warning." Solomon didn't move. To do what exactly? Garvin stepped closer, close enough that his belt brushed Solomon's knee. "To stop making a scene. We don't want trouble. Just move to the back." Solomon turned his head, calm, deliberate, his voice low but sharp. "You're the only one making trouble." Garvin's nostril flared, and that's when it slipped. The mask cracked. "You think that uniform makes you better than everybody else," he spat. "This is a high school, man, not your base." The words landed like a grenade. A hush swept the rows. A little girl stopped fidgeting in her seat. A father froze mid-zoom with his camera. Even Mally stepped back half a pace, realizing too late that something irreversible had just been said. Solomon didn't flinch. He inhaled, not to ease himself, but to anchor his focus. "You should walk away," he said quietly. Garvin didn't. His hand dropped toward the buckle of his belt, not on his weapon, but close enough to send a warning. That's when Creed rose from his seat. He didn't shout or puff up his chest. He just stepped into the aisle, calm and deliberate, like the situation had just become his to handle. The gym wasn't completely silent, but close. Creed's voice cut through the space, firm and steady. "If you lay a hand on him," Creed said, "you'll be answering to me." Garvin turned, frowning. "And who the hell are you?" Creed moved another pace closer. "The man telling you this ends now." Up front, a school board member noticed attention and leaned toward the principal. An assistant principal stood up and began heading down the aisle, whispering into her radio as she moved. The staff was finally realizing this wasn't going to fade quietly. More SEALs began rising from their seats, scattered around the room. No order given, no words exchanged. just instinct. Within seconds, all 6 were standing. Garvin's eyes darted from face to face, realizing this wasn't a simple confrontation. These men weren't restless or uncertain. They were composed, grounded, and dangerous in their calm. The air seemed to tighten around them, pressure before a storm. Creed advanced another step. "You've got 2 pals," he said evenly. "Walk away now, or watch this turn into something you don't want." Mally's voice broke through. "Let's just back off, man." But Garvin still lingered, pride locking him in place. Solomon spoke again, but this time to Creed. "Don't waste your breath. He's already chosen." Creed didn't smile. He just lowered his tone one last time. "Don't confuse quiet for weakness." Finally, Garvin stepped back, not far, but far enough. His hand fell from his belt, and color burned across his cheeks. He was outnumbered, outmatched, and he knew it. The principal appeared beside the aisle, whispering something low and firm. Whatever she said was enough. Both guards turned and walked toward the back exit, eyes forward, not meeting a soul. Solomon exhaled, slow and measured. Creed sat down again without a word. The SEALs stayed on their feet, silent but solid. The moment still hung heavy in the air. From the stage lineup, Tyron Drayton saw everything, his hands tight at his sides. He stood near the center of the graduating class, wedged between a girl with long braids and a boy constantly tugging up his gown. Around him, laughter and whispers carried on, but Tyron couldn't hear any of it. He'd seen the guards approach his father as soon as the anthem ended. At first, he told himself it was nothing. Maybe they were helping someone find a seat. But deep inside, he knew better. Then he saw the stillness in his father's posture, calm, composed, but locked in. Tyron recognized that look. He'd seen it years ago when he came home crying after someone at school said something cruel. His dad didn't raise his voice then either. He just sat the same way, unyielding as steel. From his place in line, Tyron kept watching. He couldn't hear the words, but the movements told the story. The guard standing too close. His father, steady, then a tall man in a dark coat rising to his feet. Tyron knew, instinctively, that man wasn't just another parent. He knew his father. He moved like a soldier. Then another stood, and another. The sound in the room shifted, the temperature, the tension. Everyone was watching now. Tyron's heart hammered in his chest. He wasn't afraid. He felt something deeper, a blend of pride and fire. He'd grown up on fragments of his dad's military past. Never the full stories, just glimpses. A buddy who sent Christmas cards every year. A scar from somewhere over there. A seal box in the garage marked Kandahar. He never knew the names, never saw the faces, until now. And here they were, standing again, like they'd never stopped having his father's back. Tyron blinked hard, fighting the sting in his eyes. He wouldn't cry, not here, not now. The line shuffled forward. A few names were called. Applause started again, hesitant at first, then building, like someone had pressed play after a pause. But the mood had changed. It wasn't about balloons or banners anymore. It was about respect. An assistant principal tapped Tyron's shoulder and said something he didn't catch. He nodded automatically. The student next to him leaned in and whispered, "That your dad?" Tyron didn't answer. He didn't have to. The whole gym had seen it. And now they all knew who Solomon Drayton really was. In the crowd, Creed stayed standing. He didn't scan for attention or approval. His eyes stayed on Solomon, still seated, hands calm on his knees, gaze steady on the stage, as if nothing had happened. But something had. The other SEALs remained upright too, silent, not posing, just present. Their stillness carried more weight than any words ever could. A few parents clapped louder now with each student's name, as if trying to drown out the earlier tension with applause. The gym breathed again, alive, awake, changed. And Solomon Drayton sat still, not defiant, not bitter, just there, a father watching his son step into the next chapter of his life. But the moment that would shatter the calm hadn't arrived yet. And when Tyron's name finally echoed through the speakers, the room would no longer be able to pretend nothing had happened. The line was inching forward now. Some students still tugged at their caps, whispered jokes, and tried to stay in the glow of celebration. But Tyron wasn't there anymore, not in that lightness, Not in that mood. His thoughts kept circling back to his father, sitting alone, surrounded by faces yet utterly centered, as if that single chair been placed there for him and no one else. There was something in his father's stillness, quiet, composed, immovable, and something in the way those men, those warriors, had risen beside him without hesitation, without a word. For the first time, Tyron understood he'd never truly grasped the full weight his father carried. He'd seen the photos, the medals resting inside that old wooden box, the folded flag tucked neatly on the living room shelf. But those things had always been silent, artifacts of something too large to name. Today, they weren't just memories. Today, they breathed. They stood. They moved. The assistant principal called another name. Then another. Tyron was now 3 people from the stage. His palms were damp. He wiped them on his gown and drew in a slow breath. The girl in front of him toned with a shaky smile. "You ready?" Tyron managed a grin. "More than you think." He took a step forward. Across the gym, Solomon leaned slightly forward in his chair, eyes locked on the stage. He didn't clap for every student, not out of disregard, but because all his attention was drawn to the boy in the black robe and red and white honor cords. The boy who, when he smiled, looked so much like his mother. One name, then another. The announcer paused, cleared her throat, and spoke the next name with weight, Tyron Drayton. For a breath, the gym went still. Half a second, maybe less, before the sound erupted. Applause, cheers, whistles. But what set it apart wasn't the noise. It was a rhythm. It wasn't wild. It was deliberate, steady. The 6 SEALs who still stood raised their hands and began to clap together in perfect unison. Not for show, not for attention. Each strike of their palms sharp and measured. A salute without the salute. A message that said, "We see you. We see him. We honor both." Tyron walked across the stage slowly, chin lifted, step sure. His heart thundered, not from nerves, but from pride. Not pride in himself alone, but in knowing exactly who his father was and what it meant to carry that name. He took his diploma, shook the principal's hand, and turned toward the audience. His eyes searched until they found Solomon. His father didn't wave, didn't rise. He just met his son's eyes and gave the smallest, deepest smile of the day. Tyron nodded once, then stepped down from the stage. The applause still rolled through the room. Parents who had been silent before were now clapping hard. Some stood. A few wiped their eyes, unsure why exactly, only that they had witnessed something that mattered. Solomon leaned back in his chair, letting the moment sink into him. He wasn't a man who cried in public. But inside, something eased. Not sorrow, not pain, just a quiet release, the kind that comes when a circle finally feels whole, even if imperfectly so. The ceremony went on. Names kept being called. But the air had changed. Every student who crossed that stage now walked in the echo of what had just taken place, not because it was dramatic or viral, but because it was true. And the story didn't end with the applause. When father and son met again outside the gym, it would be more than pride between them. Something deeper would pass from one to the other. 20 minutes later, the last name was read. The graduates stood, through their caps, screamed with joy, and clung to one another like they hadn't met in years. Phones flashed, cameras clicked, balloons floated. Students poured out through the double doors into the sunlit backlot. Solomon didn't move right away. He stayed seated, letting the wave of sound wash over him. The laughter, the music, the sweeping motion of silver and red gowns. His gaze followed Tyron as the boy disappeared down the hall with his classmates. A teacher high-fived him. Another pulled him in for a quick hug. And then, even amid the noise, Tyron turned, just once, looked back. Solomon caught it. A brief glance that said everything. "Did you see me?" And Solomon's expression held the answer every second. The crowd began thinning. Parents with bouquets and balloons drifted toward the exits, calling out congratulations that echoed through the gym. Finally, Solomon rose, stretching his legs, feeling the weight of the long sit fade. Creed walked up beside him as the room emptied. He didn't speak at first, just met Solomon's eyes, then looked toward the doors. "You all right?" he asked quietly. Solomon nodded. "I've been through worse." Creed exhaled a small laugh. "Yeah, Still shouldn't have gone down like that. No, Solomon said, his voice even. It shouldn't have. Another SEAL, Javier Meeks, joined them. We tried to stay invisible, he said, but once that guy reached for his belt. Solomon lifted a hand, stopping him gently. You all did what needed doing. That was enough. They stood there for a few more seconds, letting the sound fade to nothing. Then Solomon said quietly, I want to see my boy. Outside, the sun burned bright on the concrete, stretching long shadows from the bleachers across the backlot. Clusters of students gathered in small circles, posing for pictures, shouting, tossing their caps again into the glare of the afternoon. Calling out to relatives, Tyron stood near the flagpole, gown half unzipped, diploma folder in one hand, phone in the other. When he saw his father making his way through the crowd, he stopped mid-sentence. Everything around him dimmed, voices, laughter, music, until there was just the two of them meeting halfway. Tyron spoke first. You good? Solomon nodded once. You? Yeah, Tyron said quietly, then looked down. They tried to move you. I know. Tyron's jaw tensed. I was ready to walk off that stage. Dad, I swear I was 2 seconds away from saying something. Solomon placed a firm hand on his son's shoulder. And that's exactly why you didn't. Tyron frowned. What do you mean? Because you knew I could handle it, Solomon said. And because you handled your moment like a man. You didn't let anyone take it from you. Tyron held still for a second, his breath catching. Who were those guys who stood up? Solomon turned slightly. The 6 SEALs were out near the exit now, talking quietly among themselves, no attention-seeking, just watchful as always. They are men I bled beside, Solomon said. Men who understand what loyalty really means. Men who don't forget. Tyron nodded slowly. That was powerful. It was necessary, Solomon replied. Sometimes silence speaks louder than shouting. And sometimes standing up without a word says more than 1,000 speeches ever could. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Tyron smiled. You gonna tell me those war stories now? Solomon chuckled. Some of them. You're finally old enough for the real parts. They stood there, shoulder to shoulder, not just father and son anymore, but 2 men bound by something unspoken, something lived. Across the lot, Creed lifted a hand, not a wave, but a gesture of respect. Tyron returned it instantly. The sun kept climbing higher, but for the Drayton men, time slowed. Yet one last moment still waited, the lesson that hadn't yet been said out loud. By the time they started walking back toward the parking lot, most of the crowd had thinned. A few families lingered, laughing beside folding chairs or loading cars with flowers and gift bags. The buzz of celebration had softened into that quiet calm of a day ending well. Solomon unlocked the old Charger, the same one his wife used to drive to parent-teacher meetings and weekend trips. Tyron paused at the passenger door, running a finger along a long scratch near the handle. She would have been the loudest one cheering today, he said softly. Solomon smiled faintly, and she'd have made you retake every photo until your smile was just right. They climbed inside and shut the doors. The car was warm from the sun, a small, silent cocoon shut off from the world for a few breaths. Tyron turned to his father. I gotta ask, he said. Why didn't you say anything to those guards? You just sat there. Solomon tapped the steering wheel once, then looked at him. Because I don't need to stand up to prove who I am, he said. And I don't need to raise my voice to be heard. Tyron looked out the window, thinking, you know how many times I've had to pick between letting things go or blowing up. Solomon continued. That moment today, what those men tried, it wasn't new. But how we respond. That's what shows who we are. But they disrespected you, Tyron said, his voice rising. In front of everyone. Yes, Solomon replied evenly. And everyone saw it. But they also saw the truth. 6 men who could have been anywhere else, standing up not because I asked, but because they understood what that moment meant. Tyron sat quietly, absorbing it. Son, Solomon said, life will give you 100 chances to react with anger. Sometimes anger's fair, but most times, silence cuts deeper. Dignity lasts longer. That's what people remember. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded photograph, the one of Tyron as a baby, cradled in his late mother's arms. I carried this through Kandahar, Solomon said softly. Carried it through losing her. Carried it here today. Not because it gives me strength, but because it reminds me what's worth protecting. Tyron's voice dropped. You always knew who had your back. Solomon smiled faintly. I didn't need to know, he said. I just had faith. Real men don't vanish when things get uncomfortable. They show up, and they stand. A pause. I want to be like that, Tyron said quietly. Like you. You already are, Solomon replied. You walked that stage with pride. You didn't let anger steal your moment. You stayed grounded, even when the world was trying to shake you loose. Outside, the last of the SEALs were climbing into their cars. Creed looked once more toward the Charger before driving off. Solomon gave a single nod. No words, just mutual understanding that would outlast a day. Tyron leaned back against the seat. So, what now? Solomon turned the key. The engine rumbled to life. Now, he said, we drive home, and you pick dinner. Tyron grinned. Waffle House. Solomon chuckled. Of course. They rolled out of the parking lot, the school shrinking behind them, but what had happened inside that gym wasn't going anywhere. For everyone who'd seen it, that day had changed something. And for Tyron Drayton, it marked more than a diploma. It was a day he learned that manhood has nothing to do with noise, and everything to do with how you carry yourself once the world stops watching. Some people shout just to be seen. Others sit in silence, and are never forgotten,